Okay, so this is a mini lecture on the book of Judges, an intro to the book of Judges from um, just after the conquest of Israel. So the idea of the book of Judges, the main idea of the book of Judges is that it's a chaotic time. It comes between the book of Joshua and the books of Samuel and Kings. So it comes after Israel has been conquered by Joshua. And that is a very triumphant book, the conquering of Israel, crossing the Jordan. Moses doesn't get to go. Aaron dies earlier, but the next generation successfully takes over. And then after Joshua dies, the book of Judges starts out. The first line in chapter 1 is, and it happened after the death of Joshua, and so on. That is a very conscious repetition of the beginning of the book of Joshua itself, which starts out after the death of Moses. So it's between great leaders, between Moses and David, that this is set in. So we think that the texts were originally from about 1200 BCE or 1000 BCE. Nobody really knows. They're legendary. As you read the text, you get a sense that it's a text of a bunch of heroes. But then it was collected most probably 500 years later than that, around 721 BCE, and after the destruction of the northern kingdom. So Israel used to have two kingdoms. There were 12 tribes, but then 10 tribes in the north were destroyed and scattered. And so this is a very scary time, and the book of Judges reflects the time in which it was collected. All the stories were collected. So the books have a pattern after the first two chapters. Even in the second chapter, the people do bad things. They start to worship the wrong gods, and God causes them to be defeated in battle and ruled over. And then God gives them a judge or a chief to rescue them after a certain amount of time. The chief isn't really chosen by any kind of system. He's not someone who inherits the position. It's not a monarchy. He doesn't get voted in. The way that he becomes a chief is that he's charismatic. And by the way, the book of Judges really should be called the book of chiefs. None of these people are judges in a legal sense, the way that we have judges. The leader is charismatic, and maybe if you're reading it from a religious point of view, then what you understand is that the leader is given his charisma or hers by God. So that's the idea, that they're invested with somehow a power to lead. The end of the line is Samson. It's not the last piece of the book of Judges, but it's a book of chaos, and after that there's even more chaos and horror. The thing that gets repeated again and again in the book of Judges is the line, in those days there was no king in Israel, every man did what was right in his own eyes. So it's a book of political chaos, and there's a feeling of Wild West, and there's a feeling of foreboding that if everyone is using their own standard, then and essentially what that ends up meaning is that they use violence to solve their problems. And so it's not just a Western, it's also a horror movie. So the other thing is, I'm going to read this quote from Robert Alter, who's a great translator of the Bible, the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible. He says, quote, if there is a tension in the book of Judges between a divine plan and a disorderly character of actual historical events, between the divine promise and the failure to see it fulfilled. And there is another tension between God's will, his providential guidance, and human freedom. The depth with which human nature is imagined in the Bible is a function of it being conceived and caught in the powerful interplay of this double dialectic between design and disorder, providence and freedom. So I'm just going to repeat the double dialectic idea. So there are historical events, and those are kind of random. And then there's a divine promise that God is going to give this people the land of Israel, which we've been reading about up to now, again and again. And those are in tension with each other. There has to be the happy ending. Otherwise, why even write any of the Bible? And then there's another dialectic or tension between the idea of providence and freedom, how can you have, if everything is destined to happen, then how are these people free agents? And then if they're not, how are they responsible for anything they do? This is a kind of a typical problem in the Bible. Okay, so if we look just at a couple of different things, a couple of more concepts, and then I'm going to look at some of the pieces of the text. First concept, Israel is a theocracy, but it's a theocracy with the God Yahweh at the head. It's like Yahweh is the feudal lord and the head of the church and the head of the state and the head of the government. But Yahweh is a God and is not a person that you can go to. So it's a very strange kind of system, or it's not really a system. God's law is supposed to be supreme, and everybody is under that God. And we saw that in the case of Aaron and Aaron's sons. No one's above the law. No one's above God. But that is very confusing for people. They don't understand how that works, the invisible God, and how they should be obeying him. So concept number two, the God Yahweh has promised Israel and the land of Canaan to the Israelites and the Hebrews, but the promise is not assured. If the Israelites are unfaithful, then they lose the land. And that's what happens in Judges again and again. They lose it, they get it back, and so on. And the other concept that I wanted to emphasize is that there is a really special concern for the poor, for widows and the fatherless. Widows are the lowest members of society. They're women and they have no male to sponsor them. And there is, in this book of Chiefs and really the book of Chaos, there is a special problem for these people. So the poor, the widows, the fatherless, and strangers are the people that the book of Judges is concerned with most. Okay, but that's not what you get at the beginning. At the beginning, you get all kinds of weird stories. Like, for example, in chapter 1, lines 6 through 8, there's a story of Adoni Bezek, and he's a guy who gets, he's a king. Adonai means Lord, so it's Lord Bezek, and he loses to the Israelites and his fingers and toes are cut off. And then he says this is what he did to 70 other people. So there are at least two ways of taking a kind of, not a lesson, but a conclusion of what's being depicted. One is that this is a story of revenge and an eye for an eye. And the other is the last shall be first, which is a line I take from the New Testament, that people who are crushed get put on top. All right, next, in chapter 1, line 13 to 15, is a story of Caleb and his wife. And, you know, if I'm telling you a story that you don't remember what's going on in that story, you should stop the video and read it, and then, because this is a 2-line story, and then come back. Caleb and his wife. So it's a folklore story. The idea is that the conquering hero gets the hand of the princess. So that's pretty simple. But then the princess asks for more land. So this is not really the typical folklore story. There seems to be justice and retribution, but not really. And there's a story of individual deals being cut. And, hey, Daddy, why don't you give me some more? It's weird, and the feeling of the little conquests is hard to understand. It's also a situation where the tribes don't really coordinate with one another. Okay, so then you look at verses 23 to 26. It's about the founder of Luz, and the house of Joseph uses a spy to conquer this city. So is that ethical? Is it wartime ethics? Is it the kind of thing, if you help me, I'll help you? One thing to understand here is that God is not in the story. God is not a part of it. In the earlier stories, there were people who help the Israelites and they get rewarded, but God is mentioned, and here that just doesn't happen. Look at the end of chapter 1, verses 35 to 36. There's the slavery of the Amorites. They were given hard labor, and they're ironically given hard labor by the house of Joseph. So the people who are writing this and putting these stories together, they're awake and aware of ironies. like this one. The things that happen in these stories are, like I said before, that there's violence. People are solving their problems with violence. There are chieftains who are charismatic military leaders, and they don't necessarily have so much legitimacy. So that's what I want you to pay attention to, is what, if any, ethical kind of patterns can you see? What are the roles of women in the story, especially women in the story? How is power distributed in a way which we haven't seen before? Or is it continuous with what we've seen before? Okay, enjoy the reading, and I'm going to see you on Monday in a synchronous class, and we're going to talk about the books of Judges that I asked you to read, the chapters in Judges, and I'm asking you to come to class with a question. Everybody has a question. Okay, I'm going to stop.